Hello and welcome to the next in our series of conversations with giants in medicine. I'm Ushma Neal with the Journal of Clinical Investigation, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Eugene Braunwald from Harvard Medical School, who's often been called the father of modern cardiology. Braunwald was the first to define the pathophysiology of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and demonstrate the salvage of ischemic myocardium following coronary occlusion. Science Watch has listed Braunwald as the most frequently cited author in cardiology, and beyond the numerous awards and 20 honorary degrees, he was the first cardiologist elected to the National Academy of Sciences. Nobel Prize winners in medicine have named Braunwald as the person who has contributed the most to cardiology in recent years. We look forward to hearing a little bit about your path through medicine. Do you think you can tell us a little bit about your beginnings and how you got to the United States and what initially drove you to get to medical school?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here and an honor to be interviewed for this series. I was born in Vienna, Austria, and had a idyllic childhood there, which was involved with an excellent school and tutors in English and, of course, piano. And I learned a lot about music as a child because my parents were very interested in opera. Started going to the opera at the age of 5. And then March 12th, 1938, everything changed because Austria was annexed by Germany. The Nazis came in, Hitler came in and was welcomed by the population. It was not a war. And of course, the fury against the Jews played out very rapidly. I stopped going to school. Within days, the benches in the parks where I used to play had yellow signs saying, "Jews can't sit here." And it was a very troubling period. It was shocking to my parents, who had many ties in the community, and they were all shut down. We escaped from Austria at the end of July of 1938 with a couple of close calls. But of course, we're very lucky. When I say we, I mean my nuclear family, that is my parents, my younger brother and I. We escaped to England.
I've heard you say before that you likened it to the sound of music without the music.
That's right, The Sound of Music. That movie really showed a lot of that, except there was no music involved. And we ended up in London really just with the shirts on our back and with no possessions at all. The Jewish Relief Agency got us a 1.5-room apartment, and within a few days my parents were working, wrapping packages, and also taking English lessons. Of course, I had some English tutoring, so I was sort of the big shot in the family because for a month or so I was also the family translator. And then off to school, and then a year later, when the war began, that is the 1st of September 1939, when the Germans began to bomb Poland and war was declared, my brother and I were evacuated to a small village in northern England after living with a wonderful family for a couple of months. I got a postcard to take a train. 2 days later, we're going to America. My parents waited for us at the train station in London. And 2 days later, we were on the President Harding, which was one of the last passenger ships to go across the Atlantic, because the German U-boats were out in force, and even though it was an American boat, there was a lot of concern. because we were lend-leasing to Britain. We were clearly on the side of the English, and the Germans did not want this traffic to go on.
And you landed in New York then?
We landed in New York and around Thanksgiving in 1939, and lived in Brooklyn. We had some relatives there who were responsible for bringing us and many others in our family over to the United States. So it was a harrowing experience, but I have to say that I don't consider myself a child of the Holocaust. I feel that I came close to a cliff, but never went over the cliff.
After grammar school, you landed at Brooklyn Tech.
That's right, which was, and still is, an elite school. I had a very tough exam, entrance examination, and it was, so it was during World War II when engineering was reigned supreme. And I think that was the thing to go into. And I almost went to engineering, but at last minute decided that I would go into medicine.
So what changed your mind and pushed you more towards medicine?
Well, I think there was a push and a pull. I think the push was that there were a lot of courses in shop and drafting, which I was not really very good at. I did well in mathematics and physics, but not in the manual courses, which of course weren't really necessary for engineering, but that's the way the school was designed. So I became uncomfortable about that. And then I thought it was quite impersonal. And so those are the two things. But when I went to medical school, I had an early interest in cardiology because cardiologists were either electricians or plumbers. So either mechanical engineers or electrical engineers. And so that cardiology is the closest thing in medicine to engineering.
Now, while you were at medical school, you took an elective in your last year that introduced you a little bit more to cardiology.
Yes. So I had cardiology sort of in the back of my mind, even before I entered medical school. And then I became more excited about it as a student in the physiology course. Now, when I entered my senior year at NYU Medical School, not far from here, electives and research electives were not part of medical education. So that is a new thing that was introduced by the Dean of Students at the medical school, Bill Hubbard, who later became a close friend. And he pushed me into taking an elective. And I took an elective with Dr. Ludwig Eichner, who at that time ran the cardiac catheterization laboratory. Now, cardiac catheterization is a diagnostic technique that's carried out probably at 5,000 hospitals now, and it's a key technique in diagnostic technique in cardiology. But at that time, it was sort of an advanced human research technique. There were only 12 cardiac cath labs in the country. And so I felt I got in on the ground floor of that, and that was an eye-opening experience to be in a serious research laboratory, and became interested in the physiology, the pathophysiology of heart failure, which I'm interested in and working on today. And it was the early days of valve surgery, and we studied the hemodynamics of valvular abnormalities, and that's never been far removed from my mind. So this is something that occurred 61 years ago, and it left a very deep imprint.
Now, also during this time, meaning medical school, was when you were still clinging to one of your first loves, and that was classical music.
Mm-hmm.
and you were able to carry a spear in a production of an opera at the Met.
Yes. So I mentioned music, my introduction to music in Vienna, and music has remained a very important part of my life. My parents introduced me to it as a child, but I didn't need much more stimulation. So there were two things that I got to do while in college and then in medical school in New York. And one was Arturo Toscanini was probably the leading conductor of the time. And some people say the leading conductor of the 20th century, but it's sort of hard to, it's very difficult to compare. Anyway, the NBC actually created a first-class orchestra for Toscanini, an orchestra that ran with the New York Philharmonic, with the Boston Symphony, with the Chicago Symphony, so first-class orchestra. And they had a broadcast every Sunday afternoon. And because it was broadcast, they couldn't charge admission. So if you wrote away for tickets early enough, you would get tickets, and if you came in and waited online, you could get very good seating. So throughout high school and college, and maybe the first year or two of medical school, I attended these Toscanini concerts. And I would come and wait and do my homework sitting down outside the Studio 8H, also not far from where we are here today. It was a wonderful exposure to classical music. The first date I had with my first wife, Nina, now deceased, she was a classmate of mine in college and then in medical school. So I took her to a Toscanini concert. I did not tell her that these were free tickets. She was enormously impressed. She also was interested in classical music, and she had never seen Toscanini, so this was a very big deal. Took a couple of more concerts until I told her that these were free tickets. By that time, it was safe to tell her that.
And after that point, I read that you, in order to discharge part of your military service, you took a position at the NIH, working with Stanley Sarnoff.
That's right.
On myocardial oxygen consumption.
That's correct.
So how did that part of your career influence your thoughts about cardiology?
Well, so I had this experience as a student that set me on the cardiology track. But it wasn't clear where I would land, whether it would be research or clinical. I think the path of becoming a clinical cardiologist was one that was also very appealing to me. And actually, I have done a lot of clinical cardiology in my life and continue to do it right now. But the research part came, I had a postdoctoral fellowship in the other cardiac catheterization laboratory at Bellevue. So here's Bellevue, a city hospital. And that had 2 of the 12 cardiac catheterization laboratories in the United States at the time, and maybe 2 out of 20 in the world. And that was with André Cournat, who worked on a different floor from Eichner, and I spent a year there. And that firmed up my interest in research. And that also led to my being accepted by the what was then the National Heart Institute. And that was in lieu, the Public Health Service was a uniform service, although I never had a uniform. And it discharged my military obligation. There was a doctor draft.
During the Korean War.
Yeah, during the Korean War, and also for about 15 years thereafter. And so that worked out quite well for me.
So you left to go to Hopkins to finish a clinical residency, but then came back to the NIH's chair of cardiology. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like and your experiences in working on tackling hypertrophic cardiomyopathy?
Yeah. Well, the NIH years, which were from 1955 to 1968, you're absolutely right, with a year taken out at Hopkins, and because I wanted to be fully boarded in internal medicine, that turned out to be very useful for other things that I did later. It was an extraordinary time. It was it's hard to describe because there were so many avenues and so many possibilities and such a rich environment, not rich financially, which it was, by the way, but also rich in terms of ideas, and the fact that there were incredible colleagues and tremendous opportunities for interaction with people. Research had grown up really as a cottage industry. You think of the lonely researcher bent over usually his microscope, and that it would be something that was done in their spare time. And research is obviously it's a profession, it's a career, and it requires a lot of facilities. It requires, if you're a clinical investigator, like I have been, it requires access to patients and facilities for patients. It requires core laboratories. It requires things that one person can't have. It requires an institution behind it. For example, in cardiology, it requires imaging. It requires a biochemistry, access to biochemical measurements. All of those things were abundant. They were just growing at the NIH. And at that time, that did not exist at universities, even the finest universities. That doesn't mean that there weren't very, very good people and outstanding people, but the way modern research was conducted developed in Bethesda in the intramural program. And I think that many of the people who you have interviewed for this really got their start in the intramural program at the NIH.
Yes.
And so I felt I was extraordinarily lucky to be able to get that assignment. And I asked to go into a physiology laboratory, even though I continued some work in cardiac catheterization at the time. But my main assignment was in the laboratory of cardiovascular physiology. And Stanley Sarnoff was a brilliant physiologist who had tremendous ideas about experimental design. He introduced me to a whole new way of thinking about the circulation. And the first project that I began to work on in this laboratory in July 1955, a project that he had not yet begun, so I was able to get it on the ground floor of this, was what determines how much oxygen, how much energy the heart needs to do its work. Mm-hmm. And that was very formative in a number of ways. First of all, to learn experimental design and to learn about cardiac physiology and particularly how to work in an experimental laboratory. Everything up to then had been in patients in cardiac cath labs. So, so I worked in his laboratory for a couple of years, and then when I came back after years at Hopkins, I was given my own lab. I continued to work on myocardial oxygen consumption. So it started in the Sarnoff lab, but then I was able to continue doing that in my own laboratory. And so I think we learned a lot over the course of 13 years about oxygen consumption. And, um, and the reason that's played an important part in my subsequent life is because the most common cause of heart disease is ischemia. Whether ischemia causes angina or the ischemia causes a full-blown myocardial infarction. So ischemia is a condition in which there is an imbalance between oxygen supply and demand. And so I had learned and had contributed to an understanding of what one side of this balance is, what determines demand. And since we know that ischemia is an imbalance between supply and demand, and this gives us a handle of how to treat ischemia, namely to reduce demand,
right,
is one way of treating it. And of course, to increase supply is another. It's pretty straightforward, but that's how I got into the field of myocardial infarction.
I read a story about how you were visiting the University of Rochester, and there was a man who wanted to show you about how to treat angina in his dogs, and that led you to many of your thoughts and discoveries essentially on carotid sinus stimulation.
Yeah, so that was a lucky accident and what you might call an aha moment. So I've had basically two aha moments, and they came close together, one in 1967 and one in 1968. The first one was when I visited Rochester. I was introduced to, in 1967, I was introduced to a young assistant professor of surgery, Seymour Schwartz, who I still see. He became a very distinguished chairman of surgery at Rochester and wrote the leading surgical textbook. But this was at another time, and neither of us were thinking about textbooks or chairmanships in 1967. And he showed me a colony of dogs in which he had produced experimental hypertension. He produced it by what was then the best way, which is unilateral nephrectomy and wrapping the other kidney in cellophane. And what he had done is he had the equivalent of a cardiac pacemaker, but jazzed up, that was implanted into the dogs with the leads coming out to the carotid sinus nerves. And so carotid sinus stimulation results in slowing of the heart rate and in reducing myocardial contractility and reducing peripheral vascular resistance. Now, in my studies, or in our group studies, I should say, on myocardial oxygen consumption, we found that those were the three major determinants of oxygen consumption. Mm-hmm. So he did that as a way of treating hypertension in dogs. What occurred to me on my way home from Rochester was we had also been working on the carotid sinus, but we had been working on the physiology of the carotid sinus. We weren't making a clinical connection, but I made the clinical connection. These dogs seemed to be fine. It seemed to be an effective way of treating hypertension. And let me just say that this has been resuscitated now, more than 50 years later. And there are efforts underway. There is a company that makes a carotid sinus stimulator, and there are experiments going on using that technique to treat hypertension. But I wasn't thinking of hypertension. I said, well, we know that it reduces, from studies in our lab, it reduces not only heart rate and blood pressure, but it also reduces contractility. So therefore, it must have a profound effect on reducing myocardial oxygen consumption. And wouldn't that be a great way of treating intractable angina? Mm-hmm. When I came home that evening, I said to Nina, I said, do you think that you could implant carotid sinus nerve stimulators into patients? She said, why? What for? It sounds nutty to me. I said, so I told her about the encounter I'd had with that surgeon. She says, yeah, I think I could do it. And she went she did two things. She went to the autopsy room and she learned how to dissect out the human carotid sinus nerves. Because if she's going to do that to patients, she has to. And that isn't something that is that easy to find. It is when you know where it is. And then she did a series of talks. So that, and you know, research was so different at that time from the conception of the idea on the plane coming from Rochester back to Washington. The time the first patient was treated, it took 6 weeks. And you know, now it would probably take 6 years with going through committees and going through all sorts of hurdles. Anyway, it helped. It was an excellent way to, patients would turn the stimulator on themselves, and that would
give them relief.
The second aha moment was around a patient, and still occurred just a couple of months before we moved in the spring of 1968. We told our patients that if they had unusual pain, unusually severe pain, not the usual angina, that they shouldn't stimulate their carotid sinus nerves. Because what we didn't want was that if they were having an infarction, we didn't want their blood pressure to drop and become hypotensive. We thought that that'd be risky. And one of our patients, whom Nina had implanted a stimulator, came into the clinical center of the NIH with severe chest pain and the ECG findings of an ongoing myocardial infarction.
And he didn't listen to your advice?
He did not listen to my advice, and he maintained the stimulator on. And when I came to see him in the coronary care unit, I found he had it on. I turned it off, and he was being taken care of by the staff, but obviously this was somebody I was intensely interested in, and I came back to see him about every 20 minutes, and I always found that several times he had turned the stimulator on, and I turned it off, and finally I took the stimulator, which was in a little pocket, away from him, and I said, look, you know, this isn't helping you. That evening, when I looked at the electrocardiograms that were being continuously recorded while he had his myocardial infarction in the CCU, as you generally do, I found that the electrocardiogram varied. When the stimulator was on, the ST segments, the part of the ECG that shows ischemia, was almost normal. When I came along and turned the stimulator off, it became abnormal, or became more abnormal. So he was right, and I was wrong. So the aha moment I had was, well, this means that somebody who was several hours into a myocardial infarction that you could still manipulate the amount of ischemia. See, the thinking at that time, the traditional thinking was that, you know, that it was like a light switch. You had an infarct, you had a clot in the coronary artery, and that killed the muscle. And it was like you turned the light switch off. What this patient suggested was that maybe it wasn't like a light switch, maybe it was like a dimmer, and that you could
resurrect.
And so then we had moved to La Jolla, and where I promptly set up now a dog lab. in order to study whether you could manipulate infarct size. And we found that it was possible to do that. And began to publish on the protection of the ischemic myocardium and the reduction of infarct size. In the progression about myocardial infarction, people knew about infarction, and but infarction at the time was described around 1910, 1912. It was a grave illness. The mortality rate was about 30%, the in-hospital mortality rate. And when the patients came out of the hospital, the 70% who were fortunate enough to survive, many of them went on to have heart failure. So another 20% died within the first year. So by a year, there was a mortality rate of 1 out of 2 patients. And so this was the most common cause of death in the United States and what you might call economically developed nations.
Now, you mentioned 2 of these aha moments, but there was another patient that changed a little bit about the way that you thought about cardiology, and specifically the surgery with Glenn Morrow, and where you were able to first describe the pressure gradients without an obstruction that went on to later describe that as hypertrophic cardiomyopathy.
Yes, yes, that was an extraordinary experience. So it was a patient whom we had studied at the NIH in 1958. A young man who had a loud heart murmur and symptoms of shortness of breath, and at catheterization he had a pressure gradient in between the left ventricle and the aortic valve. So he had subaortic stenosis. At that time, the condition that was recognized as a congenital subaortic stenosis was a membrane below the aortic valve leaflets. A pretty rare congenital condition, and that's what we thought he had. It was the early days of cardiopulmonary bypass. It was a big deal. At that time, I had returned from Hopkins, and I had an intermediate position before I became chief of cardiology. I was the head of the cath lab. One day, I'm doing a cardiac catheterization when a message comes from the operating room. Dr. Morrow wants to see you up there immediately. It was quite enough awkward because I was doing catheterization, I had the patient on the table. So I got somebody to take over for me because it was an unusual request. I got to the OR, open heart surgery at that time, there was a cast of thousands. Many people in the OR, a gaggle of anesthesiologists. It was the very early days of the program. Pump technicians, hematologists, obviously surgeons and their surgical assistants, scrub nurses, etc. And I come into the operating room, and Morrow is bent over the patient, and he said, Gene, you have screwed up. He said, he doesn't have subaortic stenosis. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, he said, I arrested his heart, which is a big deal. It was a big deal at that time. He opened the aorta, and he put his index finger through the aortic leaflets down into the body of the left ventricle. With his left hand, he put his finger through the left atrial appendage into the left atrium, into the left ventricle, so his fingers met in the left ventricle. He says, there is no obstruction. I've got free flow here. And I said, I don't know what
How is
is
this
going on here.
possible?
He said, well, you've made some terrible error. Well, I was horrified and concerned. I said, I didn't know what could have happened. He was upset. He was a pretty cool customer, but you know, something obviously had gone wrong. And I finally said, well, I don't know what to say, and I have a patient on the table, so I need to be excused. And as I walked out of the OR, I said, but Glenn, if you get his heart started again, and I said if, not when, because if you opened the heart and had somebody on bypass and arrested the heart, unless you fixed something, you made the patient worse. Please stick a needle into the left ventricle so we can measure, so you can measure the pressure in there. And I was devastated when I walked out. He came back, he came down a couple of hours later, and came in and was obviously mollified. He said, the boy's going to be okay. I said, that's great, thank God. He said, and you know, I measured the pressure, there was a big gradient. I said, well, how can that be? He said, I don't know, how can it be? So what was going on? And he said, well, I don't know, you know, that heart seemed normal. It was a little hypertrophied, and so we puzzled about that day in and day out. About 3 weeks into this, he finally said to me, he said, you know, he said, I've been in this longer than you have. I'm older than you are. You know, he was 36 and I was 29. He said, I can tell you, in medicine, sometimes you come across something that you just can't explain. And you don't want to get stuck there. Sometimes you just get paralyzed, and we just gotta move on. I said, I guess you're right. And that's the way it was for another month when a second patient presented with exactly the same thing. By now, we were alert to this. And we also became aware around that time that a patient had been studied in London like this. So, of course, we followed these patients, made sure they were okay, and published a paper about them. And we didn't quite know what it was, but we did feel it was an obstruction that was caused by hypertrophy of the muscle. And that led to an intense interest in this condition. We got a lot of patients. They certainly came up because open heart surgery began, and they were misdiagnosed because they had a loud systolic murmur. So before the condition was recognized, they were thought to have either a ventricular septal defect, which produces a loud systolic murmur along the left sternal border, or that they had mitral regurgitation, which produces a loud systolic murmur, but that's a little further to the left. And so we accumulated a large series.
You spent 13 glorious years at the NIH.
Yep.
You know, a time that I've read that you described as a virtual Shangri-La or a Camelot. What motivated you to take the job at UCSD, helping to found their Department of Medicine and serving as its first chair?
NIH was exactly what you said, but I became a little restless. And it's like saying, well, I like steak. I like steak a lot, but I don't like steak 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. And I began to feel a little bit about research that way. When I was at the NIH, I took non-paying faculty positions at the 2 schools in town, George Washington and Georgetown. And I taught physiology the first several years I was at the NIH. And I enjoyed the teaching of students. and being stimulated by students, which is very different from being stimulated by residents or fellows. And then as my interests began to shift more back to clinical, I went to Georgetown, where I actually served as a clinical professor of medicine for about 5 years, and did general internal medicine teaching. And so I became interested really in curricular development, and what better way is there to do that than at a new medical school, which had a very flexible approach to education, which said, look, we're going to do something new. We're going to use certain ideas that tie medicine to fundamental science, clinical medicine to fundamental science. Oh my God, that was, that's why I was put on earth, to tie these two things together. And so we went out there, and it was quite an adventure.
But then after 4 years, you got an offer of a lifetime to come back to Harvard to be chairman of medicine at the Peter Bent Brigham, which later then merged with the BI and Mass General, so in the Harvard system. You served in that role for 24 years. So what are the things you're most proud of achieving in the Harvard system?
Well, let me say a moment, why I left La Jolla. I had 4 very good years there, and by the way, the work on infarct size reduction, which started at the NIH. The actual experiments, the aha moment came in a patient at the NIH, but it was just before we left. But it was in La Jolla, where in the dog lab, we really proved it. I think and it was possible to establish a new modern curriculum, which is still exists there, and to get what I think is a very good department started. But the problem was that a decision was made by the new governor of California, Ronald Reagan, not to build a university hospital. And I felt that you cannot have a great medical school without a great hospital. Now, you can have a great hospital without a great medical school, but you cannot have a great medical school without a great hospital. And I felt that would limit the level. And what has happened, they have ultimately built the hospital, and it is a great medical school. But I didn't have 45 years to wait. And so when the opportunity in Boston came along, I took that. And that experience, was different. I mean, the same way as, the NIH prepared me in running a cardiology division to do something larger, to running a department of medicine. And the research that I did at the NIH, I was able to transport some ideas into the curriculum in California. My 4 years as chairman in California prepared me for a much bigger and tougher job, and that is at the Brigham. And it's bigger and tougher because it's much more demanding, and so the idea was to look at postgraduate training, graduate medical education, and I focused on that.
In addition to these leadership roles, you've also served as editor of Harrison's Principles of Medicine, and you're now on to the 9th edition of Braunwald's Heart Disease, the definitive textbook of cardiology. In addition, looking at your CV, you have well over 1,000 published articles, and as I mentioned in the introduction, you're one of the most cited cardiologists, if not the most cited cardiologist in the field. Do you have a special affinity for writing?
Well, I enjoy writing. Of course, English is my second language.
You couldn't tell.
Well, English is my second language, and but I do enjoy writing, and I think the textbooks I feel are important in terms of education. So just the same way as I'm interested in educating residents and medical students and working on curriculum and you know, trying to bridge the gap between clinical medicine and fundamental sciences, I'm also interested in using, you know, textbooks as an educational means. It has been gratifying. I think that with both books, one of the things that gives me the most satisfaction is when I get a letter from somebody on the subcontinent in India or Pakistan that goes like this: "Dear Professor, you know, your book is very important to me, and we use it constantly. But I'd like to point out to you, on page 1372, in the second paragraph in the column on the left, you say that this drug causes hypotension. With all due respect, sir, it causes hypertension." And so what does that mean? It means that it actually is read. By the way, those letters, of which I have received hundreds, are always correct. They're always correct. And I always, you know, reply with a letter of appreciation, tell them the next printing will correct this, because no matter how hard you try, no matter how many eyeballs go over a book like that, how many editors and how many reviewers we have, there will be things, typos, that creep in. Or sometimes they are more serious than typos, where in one chapter an illustration shows something, in another chapter it is presented another way. But it means that people are looking at it, and it means it's just not simply sitting on a shelf. So it means a capacity to reach out to many, many, many more people than you can reach out when you stand before a class.
Have you ever given a thought to a different career, or was it always medicine and always cardiology?
Well, it was halfway through high school, it switched to medicine. I think that and I have been, you know, extremely fortunate. I've always been excited by what I do. I've done a wide variety of things. I haven't talked much about practicing cardiology, but I enjoy doing that. I enjoy doing that today. I enjoy the research that we're doing now. I think that, you know, the 60 years that I've spent in research, I think it's changed a huge number of ways, but I think the questions remain similar. We worked in isolated cardiac tissue that Glenn Morrow obtained at the time of surgery in patients back then, and now we're working with large populations. But, you know, the questions endure. Myocardial ischemia is treated much, much better, but it still is a big problem. Congestive heart failure is a big deal at the present time, although it's much, much better than it was before. So I've been constantly stimulated, and I am as excited today about these questions, some of which have been ruminating for 6 decades, than I have been through all the years.
Delightful. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Braunwald.
Let me add something that you
Sure.
splice in. And I've also been extremely lucky, because in all these years I've been in wonderful institutions, and I've been in the right place at the right time. I was at NYU as they were changing their curriculum. I was at in André Cournan's laboratory at the height of its productivity the year before he won the Nobel Prize. I was at the NIH just as it was blossoming. And the same thing at UC San Diego, the same thing at Harvard. And I have been blessed with great mentors, but most of all, the young people that I've been working with, either as colleagues or as mentees, have meant a great deal to me.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and telling us a little bit about your path through medicine.